Okay. So we focused on the Civil War, and I looked. It was 5 weeks we spent talking about the Civil War, which is good. I mean, I think to be a knowledgeable American person here, I think you need to know about the Civil War. So I'm glad we talked about that. Let's dial it back, a little less heavy, a little less death, um, and we're going to talk about the 1920s. Okay, so I have, my title here is 100 years ago, and it just happens to be the 1920s was 100 years ago. Um, and I'm going to make the argument that in a lot of ways, and we're going to see if I'm right, I'm going to say right now that in a lot of ways, the modern world, a lot of things about our modern world started in the 1920s. Okay, so I actually have two readings. We're going to talk about the 1920s today and next week. Um, there's a lot of things you can talk about in the 1920s, but we're just going to focus on what was life like for people. How were things changing? Um, because in we talk about wars and presidents and politics and stuff, and that's good to know because that obviously affects the world. But what's going to change your life waking up in whatever Pennsylvania in the 1920s? What's going to change your day-to-day life? And so today, that's what we're going to talk about. Um, just regular people, regular everyday life. Okay, this week and next week. So now to put it into context, okay, the 1920s. Actually, let me pull up a timeline that I've made. Where's that timeline? Okay, here's a timeline that I was using last summer. I made it for a bunch, for the students that was in the class. The bottom was all different readings that we did, so we're not going to worry about that. The top, if you can see, is, let me try to zoom in a little bit. Um, just your basic American stuff timeline. Okay, we have the colonial period, the American Revolution in red, the Civil War in gray, and then the Green Reconstruction. So the 1920s, let's say, is right around here. Okay, it's between World War One and World War Two. So World War One was 1914 to 1919. So you're coming just after the end of World War One. And of course, they don't know it at the time, but World War II is coming. World War II is 1939 to 1945. So we're a decade before World War II, um, but we're just after the end of World War One. Now, World War One is not the most important war. It didn't change a lot. It happened for goofy reasons. It wasn't. There's not much you need to know about World War One. Okay, it happened in Europe. Um, But the way it affects American life is, a lot of young men were killed, but then the men come back, and it was kind of a dumb war. It was pointless. It was trench warfare, right, where they dig those trenches and you're in a trench. It was very slow. The battles were long. You were living in a series of trenches maybe over there for months at a time. It's wet, it's muddy, it's cold. So the men come back and are very disheartened about life. They just fought a war. They watched men die. Maybe they had their legs blown off in an explosion or who knows what, took a bullet for seemingly no reason. Okay, so World War One was like dumb. It was a pointless, it seemed like a very pointless war. These men came back and were really these young people. They came back, they were very jaded, they were very upset by what they saw, and they were ready to party. Okay, what is life? Life is pointless, so I'm just going to live it up. Okay, it's at the exact time that we've talked in the past about prohibition. Okay, um, we talked about prohibition recently, right? Not too
Yes.
long ago.
Mhm.
Okay, prohibition, and we see on my timeline 1920 to 1932. So like really the 20s was the Prohibition era. And what was prohibited in Prohibition? What was Prohibition all about?
Wasn't it alcohol?
Yeah, they
Like,
prohibited alcohol, right?
right, like you couldn't, like moonshiners and things like that.
Right. So it was illegal across the United States. There was what was it? I think the
Okay.
18th Amendment, right? It was a constitutional amendment
Huh.
that made it illegal to make or sell, I think, make or sell alcohol. Somehow, I think it was legal to consume it, but not, I think, but it was alcohol. Basically, alcohol was illegal. Now, if you remember from our discussion of prohibition, it did not change people's drinking habits. And if anything, it made people drink more alcohol. Um, but it was illegal to drink alcohol. So yeah, people made their own alcohol, moonshine or homemade beer and stuff like that.
Now we got NASCAR, believe it or not.
NASCAR, how's that related to
Okay,
NASCAR?
so prohibition,
Uh,
um, when that all started, when they started running cars on the beaches, okay, during
mm,
the prohibition times, which that was like a really long trek, okay, but they would race. And if you ever want to just learn about it, just type in prohibition in NASCAR,
hmm,
and you'll see there was a whole documentary done on it. And that's kind of how the moonshiners kind of came up with NASCAR. But it was originally done on dirt roads and beaches.
hmm.
And then they moved it into a much bigger organization like we have today. But yeah, it started with the moonshiners and prohibition.
Yeah, huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
I'm
there's
not
all
a
kinds
NASCAR
of,
fan. It's some bit of information I have. It's useless.
mhm.
I don't know why
Yeah, right.
I
Yeah.
retain it.
No, it's that kind of history is kind of interesting. So when we're talking about the 1920s today and next week, um, I think it's after World War One. People are, still really confused by what happened in the war. It's during Prohibition, but people are still partying. Okay, you have what they called was the Roaring Twenties. Let me get that back here. They called it the Roaring Twenties because like things were changing very quickly. A lot of what we identify as the modern world started, and it was just a time to party. Like for young people in particular, these men who came back from the war, they're like, screw it, I'm going to party. So like we call it, historians call it the Roaring Twenties. Okay, so let's jump in. We got a reading for today and a reading for next week. Um, Overview. It says, for many middle class Americans, the 1920s was a decade of unprecedented prosperity. Rising earnings generated more disposable income for the purchase of consumer goods. What is disposable income?
I would think disposable income is in, see, that's kind of odd. It's income that is you can throw away essentially.
Hmm.
So you would
It's
carry over.
Uh,
yeah, it's disposable income. Anybody else have an idea?
like your money going to be disappeared? Yes.
Well, yeah, it
But
sounds like it.
it is
Disposable.
Right.
money. It is money. Um,
It was over capital, basically. So if your earnings raised and it generated disposable income for the purchase of customer goods, which meant the person selling the goods was seeing more money.
Yeah, my disposable income, your disposable income is any extra money you have in your family budget or your
mhm.
checking account after you pay your rent, your mortgage, your bills, your utilities. So any extra spending cash, any free money, any extra money you have. Okay. So it says rising earnings, people were making more money. And now, of course, there's all kinds of economics involved that, we're not going to worry about. But people, regular, everyday people, middle class people had more disposable income. They had more spending money, right? Things
Okay.
were less expensive. Rent was, I don't know. The housing was cheaper. Everything was cheaper. So you just have more money. What are you going to do with that money? You might take a vacation. You might buy one of these cars we're going to talk about. All kinds of new consumer products, just things is consumer goods. Okay, so that's one thing. Henry Ford's advances in assembly line efficiency created a truly affordable automobile, making car ownership a possibility for many Americans. And interestingly, advertising became as big an industry as the manufactured goods that advertisers represented. And many families relied on new forms of credit to increase their consumption levels as they strived for a new American standard of living. Okay. So if you look at the 1800s, even the 1890s, when you see a picture from the 1890s, you can tell that's in the 1800s. But suddenly the 1910s, 1920s, things start to look different. People are dressing differently, looking differently. They have many more things that didn't exist previously. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about. So consumption in the 1920s, it says led to something, the prosperity in the 1920s led to new patterns of consumption or purchasing consumer goods like radios, cars, vacuums, beauty products, or clothing. So that's when we talk about economics, and there is some economic ideas on the GED test, the HiSET test. Consumption just means buying stuff. Okay. When you think of consume, when I think of the word consume, I think of eating, right? I consume food. I don't consume my
Consume
cell
means,
phone.
well, consume means you want, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, to consume means to take in, really.
Oh, why did I forget that? It means you take in. Oh,
Yeah.
yes, I'm going to take in food. I remember that. I got to
Right.
remember that.
Okay. So like I would literally you consume food. But anything, we all buy our cell phones. That is a consumer good. If when I go shopping, I am a consumer, right? You've probably heard that before. A person shopping, buying things, looking to buy something is a consumer, right? So advertisers are reaching out to get in touch with consumers. So consumer goods, we talk about consumers, consumer goods, and then the verb of that is consumption. New patterns of consumption doesn't mean eating everything you buy. It just means buying stuff. Okay. So Jendai, you were one of the first two people to log in. Can you read paragraph 1 for us?
Sure. Okay, here we go. Okay. The prosperity of the 1920s led to new patterns of consumption or purchasing consumer goods like radios, cars, vacuums, beauty products, or clothing. The expansion of credit in the 1920s allowed for the sale of more consumer goods and put automobiles within reach of over average Americans. Now individuals who could not afford to purchase a car at full price could pay for that car over time within interest, of course. So many products and so many Americans eager to purchase them. Advertising became a central institution in this new consumer economy. I'm sorry. I'm very, very sorry.
Okay. No, it's good. Okay, so that's another thing. We don't, we think of inventions, right? When we think of the world changing, we think of inventions. We're going to talk about Henry Ford's Model T car. Okay, those old-fashioned cars. That's an invention, right? Another invention that changed the world was credit, buying things on credit. Now, we don't have credit cards yet. That's not a thing. Credit cards aren't going to exist in the 1920s. But if I go to the store, when you buy a car today, unless you're paying for it in cash or writing a check for the full amount, you're buying the car through credit. Sometimes The dealership has its own financing. Maybe you go through a bank, right? But if I buy a $20,000 car, I'm borrowing $20,000 and getting the car today, but then I'm paying back that $20,000 plus a good chunk of interest, right? Interest is the money I pay to the bank. I'm paying them to let me borrow that $20,000, right? So maybe that $20,000 car is going to cost me $25,000 or something. Okay. People didn't really do that until the 1920s. Now, in the 1920s, you can go to the store and buy a lot of things on credit. A couch, a car, a lot of even small things, right? Back in the 80s and 90s, we had layaway. You go to the store, Kmart or someplace, and you'd buy something you'd have it layaway, right? Anybody remember that? Doing layaway in the store?
Yes.
Yeah.
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 Where you make a payment plan, right? The store works with you. You make a payment plan, and when you're done, I think when you're done, you get that thing. But it was laid away for you. You were saving it. That sort of way, it's another way for the store to get you to buy something, right? Because in the 1920s, not everybody had the money to buy a car today, but everybody probably has a few dollars a month that they can put towards buying a car, right? So if we didn't have purchasing things on credit or layaway plans or payment plans, people would buy a lot less stuff, right? You'd have to save up all the money for a car or even a house in order to buy it. So the invention of credit and buying things on credit and making payments, that's an invention, and that changes things big time. Okay. So affordable automobiles. Here's now I don't know exactly when this advertisement is from. So I may not be historically accurate, but these are the kind of cars we're talking about. Okay. It says new possibilities of mobility opened up in the 1920s for a large percentage of the US population. Once a luxury item, cars became within reach for many more consumers as automobile manufacturers began to mass produce automobiles. The most significant innovation of this era was Henry Ford's Model T Ford, which made car ownership available to the average American. So these are, I think, the closest thing to a Model T is probably this bottom left. Okay. There was other designs. Henry Ford's Model T was not the first car. There was lots of cars. In fact, this next paragraph says, by the early 20th century, hundreds of car manufacturers existed, but Ford, the company run by Henry Ford, was the first to have big factories making lots of cars that they could then make cheaply and sell cheaply. Okay. Oluwakemi, could you read paragraph 3? Oluwakemi, are you there? Maybe not right now. Monique, why don't you read paragraph 3, please?
Okay, let me just enlarge this 1 second, guys.
Hello. Please,
Oh,
can
wait.
somebody else take it? I will the class.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Oluwakemi, we'll jump back to you. Do you want to read? Or not right now? Oh, I think.
Ready. Okay.
Okay, Monique, go ahead.
In the 20th century, hundreds of car manufacturers existed, but they all made products that were too expensive for most Americans. Ford's innovation lay in his use of mass production to manufacture automobiles. He revolutionized industrial work by perfecting the assembly line, which enabled him to lower the model's price from $850 in 1908 to $300 in 1924, making car ownership a real possibility for a large share of the population. Soon, people could buy used Model Ts for as little as $5, allowing students and others with low income to enjoy the freedom and the mobility of car ownership. By 1929, there were over 23 million automobiles on the American roads.
Okay, so that's a big number. 1929, there's 23 million automobiles. Now think of how the world is going to change by that, right? That means if there's 23 million cars, it means roads are going to have to be better, right? The highway system doesn't exist yet. Our interstate highways really come about in the 50s and 60s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. But you know, roads are going to have to be better. You're going to need a bunch of gas stations if everybody's driving around expecting to get gas every so often, right? So things are going to change. The modern vacation didn't really exist until people got cars, right? Prior to getting a car, how are you? I mean, are you going to get in, ride a horse to Myrtle Beach? I don't think so. So, the modern vacation didn't really happen for families, middle class families, until people had cars, and you could drive a couple of hours to go see something you've never seen before, or go someplace famous. So the world's going to change because of that. It says the assembly line helped, and I put a picture here, that kind of thing. The assembly line helped Ford reduce labor costs within the production process by moving the product from one team of workers to the next, each of them completing a step so simple that workers had to be, in Ford's words, no smarter than an ox. Ford's reliance on the assembly line placed emphasis on efficiency over craftsmanship. Okay, so the old way of doing things was you were a craftsman. If you knew how to make a gun, you would make a gun start to finish, right? You'd make every part of it, and at the end you'd have a gun. Or if you were a cobbler making shoes, you knew how to make shoes, right? With the assembly line, and Ford wasn't the first person to do the assembly line, but with the assembly line process that he used to make the cars, Oluwakimi, yeah, you can read next. That's good. It's a different way of working, right? Instead of making something start to finish, now I'm standing. If I'm working in a Ford, just like today, mostly. If I'm working in a auto manufacturing plant, a car comes down the assembly line. I do one thing, and then it goes on. And then the next car comes. I do that same thing to that second car, and then it goes. And so no one knows how to make a car in a Ford assembly line plant, right? Everybody knows how to do one thing. Nobody knows how to do everything. So it's a different way of working, and that's going to affect people's work differently. Okay, it's a change of how things went. Let me read paragraph 5. Ford's focus on cheap mass production brought both benefits and disadvantages to his workers. Ford would not allow his workers to unionize, and the boring, repetitive nature of the assembly line work generated a high turnover rate. So people didn't work there very long because it was boring and repetitive, but he did pay well. Okay. Oluwakimi, yeah, if you want to read paragraph 6, that would be great.
Thank. On the other hand, Ford doubled workers' pay to $5 a day and standardized the workday to 8 hours, a reduction from the norm of the time. Ford also offered greater racial equality than most employment of the time. He paid white and black workers equally. Seeking his wages, the African Americans from the South moved to Detroit and large to work in factories. Ford shaped the nation's mode of industrialism to rely on paying decent wages so that workers could avoid to be the consumers of their own products.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So he did pay well. and he created the standard 8 hours workday. Um, and yeah, basically Ford did treat his. It was tough work. It was repetitive. It was boring, but you got paid well and you were treated well. Um, the goal, Ford said, was to pay his people, his workers, enough that they could afford to buy the cars that they're making. And pretty much that was true. Um, and that set, history changes because of things like that. It says, seeking these wages, many African Americans from the South, this is the 1920s, moved to Detroit. A lot of car stuff happens in Detroit and other northern large cities. That is what we now historians call the Great Migration. A lot, and that, I don't have statistics, but a lot of Black people in the South moved from their agricultural life. Last week we talked about coming out of the Civil War. What are you going to do? What skills do you have as a former slave? Now we're a couple of two generations past that, and people are still living in the South. And the South isn't all that great everywhere for an African American. So they're moving to the North. They hear about these great jobs. They hear about these jobs that you don't need a lot of skills. You don't need to have education to do. You just show up and do the job and get paid well. So that's what a lot of historians call the Great Migration. That those Blacks from the South moving out of the South, and of course, changing history, changing what's going to happen. Yeah, and Ford's goal was to make workers in his factory be able to afford the cars that they were making, which is kind of a neat idea. Rana, do you want to read paragraph 7?
Sure. The automobile changed the face of America, both economically and socially. Industries like glass, steel, and rubber processing expanded to keep up with auto production. The oil industry in California, Oklahoma, and Texas expand as Americans re, resilience on
Reliance.
reliance. Okay, reliance on oil increase, and the nation transitioned from a coal-based economy to one driven by petroleum.
Yeah, petroleum. Petroleum is just oil. Okay, so one skill that the GED test, social studies test, does ask you to know, and as I've said, it's always like, it's really just a reading test. If you're a decent reader and you can make sense of a reading, you can do pretty good on the social studies test. And there's some maps and graphs and stuff, right? But one skill, one historical skill, is to hear about one thing happening and to imagine what effects that might have, right? History is all cause and effects, right? Henry Ford didn't invent the car, but he cars had been around for a few decades. But he invents the Model T, and then he invents his factories were like his big invention of how to make the Model T, make it cheaper, sell it cheaper, more people buy. 23 what did it say? 23 million cars are on the road by the end of the 20s. How is that gonna have ramifications, effects across the country? Well, to make 23 million cars, you're going to need a lot of glass, steel, rubber, oil, right? You're going to need all hundreds, thousands of gas stations, hundreds of companies making those gas stations, right? In every town. So just by making cars, which are cool, everybody wants a car back then. Obviously, you get a lot of mobility, freedom. Everybody loves a car, so people buy it, and like just that fact alone changes quite a lot. So it says the need for public roadways required local and state governments to fund a dramatic expansion of infrastructure, which permitted motels and restaurants to spring up and offer new services to millions of newly mobile Americans with cash to spend. With this new infrastructure, new shopping and living patterns emerged, and streetcar suburbs gave way to automobile suburbs as private automobile traffic on public roads began to replace mass transit on trains and trolleys. Okay, so I've never heard the term streetcar suburb before, but what do you think that means? A suburb is like a town outside of a city, right? So what do you think a streetcar suburb is?
The car only go on that area, yes, no?
Well, okay, I guess we need to know what a streetcar is.
Okay.
Let me pull up.
Is that like some kind of transportation would take people around?
Yeah, streetcar, like, you know,
Oh,
this is
okay.
a streetcar. Okay, these two are kind of the old-fashioned
Okay.
ones. So a streetcar happens maybe the late 1800s. Some cities still have them. I know Pittsburgh and Philadelphia had them into the 70s. A streetcar runs on tracks, like sometimes down the middle of a city street, there's like a couple of train tracks. A streetcar runs on tracks, and then there's a cable up above it, and like a little arm from the streetcar up to the cable, and they're run by electricity.
So that's like trolleys, what they
Yeah, trolley. Yeah,
call
it's a
it in
trolley.
Philadelphia.
Yeah. Are there still trolleys in Philadelphia, or do you mean in the past?
No, I mean now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Same thing. Same thing. It's a trolley. It's the same thing, right? You see, um, there's a bar up to this electrical wire, and that's where it gets its power. It's running on tracks, and it's public transportation, right? That predates. That's kind of almost like half train, half car, really. But it predates. It comes before automobiles. Um, so a streetcar community or a streetcar suburb, I think what that means to me is a suburb outside the city where people commuted in. Sometimes you hear about sometimes in when people are talking about cities and urban growth and stuff, you talk about I just had it was in my mind. What is it? Bedroom communities. Okay. A bedroom community is where people work in the city, but they live outside the city. So they go home and they sleep at home in their bedroom in the suburbs outside the city, but then they travel in, they commute in to the city. So what that means to me maybe is a streetcar suburb might be a town outside the city that has a streetcar or a subway, public transportation into the city so people can do their jobs in the city and then go back home outside. Now, so streetcar suburbs give way to automobile suburbs and people are driving more. Okay. So that's going to change. Motels and restaurants spring up. People are traveling. Things change. Okay. So in the 1920s, the first cars happen in the early 1900s, the 1900s. In fact, I think really there was even very basic automobiles before 1900, but really it was the 1920s before they really took off. And then as we saw, 23 million by the end of the 1920s. So the invention and development and expansion of popularity of the automobile really changes America. You go from, a lot of people never traveled at all, right? If I can't get there on the back of a horse, I'm not going to get there. And who wants to ride a horse for long periods of time? So, people really start to travel because they can afford a car, and now they can do that. Another thing, now we'll talk about airplanes for a little while here. Okay, airplanes. It mentions Orville Wright. Okay, Do we know the Wright brothers? Let me pull up a picture.
I heard of the Wright brothers before. You know I have.
Who were the Wright brothers? Who were the Wright brothers?
They invented the aeroplane.
Yeah, the very basic airplane around, I think it was 1903. Okay, so the Wright brothers had their first flight, and this is a photograph of it in I'm pretty sure it was 1903. Okay, now it's basically a glider. Now people had gliders,
Mhm.
but this is what they did was the first sustained, and it lasted for like 10 seconds, but sustained, they thought that was a long time, 10 seconds, powered flight. It wasn't gliding like on a hang glider or something, like a kite or something. So it had a motor. It was very, very basic, but they did it. They showed that it could be done. And then in the 1900s, by the end of the 1900s, by 1910, by 1920, planes were happening very quickly. Okay, so we go from this picture here to World War One. By the 19 teens, 1914 is World War One. You have people fighting, in planes with guns. So you go from the Wright brothers barely flying, barely doing anything that we would call flying, to these biplanes and even triplanes, 3 wings. So the automobile picked up very quickly, and I think plane technology, flying technology happens very quickly. It's very impressive. So now we're going to talk about, so that's the Wright brothers. Now we're going to talk about Charles Lindbergh. Ruby, could you read paragraph 9 for us?
In the 1920s, not only we
Witnessed.
witnessed a transportation in group transportation, but also major change in air travel. By the mid 1920s, men as well as some
Pioneering.
Women like the African America stood pilot based Coleman had been flying for 2 decades, but their reminder doubles
Doubts.
doubts
Doubts.
about the
Suitability.
suitability of aeroplanes for long. Distance travel over right. One of the pioneers of aeroplane technology in the United States. Once famously decade, no flying machine will even fly from New York to Paris because no non-motor can run at the
requisite
speed for 4 days without stopping. However, in 1927, this
skepticism
was finally put to rest when Charles Lindbergh became the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, flying from New York to Paris in 33 hours. Wow.
Okay. So, like I said, so air travel develops very quickly. And
Uh-huh.
by 1927, you have Charles Lindbergh fly in his plane.
Mhm.
We're gonna read another paragraph here. The Spirit of St. Louis,
Mhm.
and he flies from New York to Paris
Mhm.
in 33 hours, um, and showing that it could be done. Right,
Yeah.
that you could cross an ocean in a day, a little bit more than a day,
Mhm.
which people have been doing on boats, right? But it takes a couple of weeks, 2 weeks to cross
Many
the ocean
months.
on a boat. So it says Lindbergh's flight made him an international hero, the best known American in the world. On his return, Americans greeted him with a parade. His flight, which he completed in the monoplane Spirit of St. Louis, seemed like a triumph of individualism in modern mass society and exemplified Americans' ability to conquer the air with new technology. So there was lots of famous flyers at this time, developing their own planes, trying things, trying to make things happen. Lindbergh was the first person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean.
Mm.
Other people had tried and died doing it. There was some pretty famous failures, but he was the first person to do it. And he really was, Charles Lindbergh was really like the first international celebrity. He's the first person in history who, I mean, a lot of people, a lot of historians say, was like the first big celebrity. I don't know why, but something about him doing that one thing, crossing the Atlantic in a plane all by himself, and landing safely in Paris. Um, Something about that just mesmerized people. And it says they greeted him with a parade. He did get a big parade in New York City when he came back. Then he did this 100-day tour, flying from city to city. And I don't know how many cities he visited across America, but he was seen, he was in all his different stops, he was seen by 25% of all Americans at the time. So 1 out of 4 Americans saw Charles Lindbergh at, he would stop and he would give a speech, or he would stop and they would give him an award in your town or whatever. So he was like the first international global celebrity, Charles Lindbergh, just because he flew across the Atlantic one time. Um, it was just a really big deal. Uh, and it was a very big deal. Um, it says following his success, the small airline industry the small airline industry began to blossom, fully coming into its own in the 1930s as companies like Boeing and Ford developed airplanes designed specifically for passenger air transport. As technologies in engine and passenger compartment design improved, air travel became more popular. In 1934, so this is 7 years after Lindbergh, the number of U.S. domestic air passengers was just over 450,000 annually. By the end of the decade, that number had increased to nearly 2 million. So, domestic air passengers means people flying within the United States, right? Not international, but domestic. Um, by the end of the 30s, you have 2 million people a year flying. Now, going on an airplane is was then and is now more expensive than buying one of those Ford Model Ts, but uh, still 2 million people a year by the end of the 1930s. Okay, so we got cars, big deal. Planes, another big deal. Doesn't really Planes don't affect the average person's daily life as much as the car does, but still, you know, think of everything in your house that has been on a plane. Things you buy came to you by plane, right? So today, so our lives, even though you're not flying on a plane every day, um, it does. And but I mean, some of us are deeply affected by planes. I mean, you international people here, you probably came by a plane. I can't imagine many people came on boats. Um, so like your life was drastically touched by flying on a plane. So the car is a very big deal. The plane technology is a very big deal. So now we get into some everyday stuff. Okay, the lure of technology. We're going to talk about radios and just consumer goods. Brittany, do you want to read paragraph 12?
I can't see a screen.
What's that, Rana? Oh, can't you see the screen
I
anymore?
can't see the screen, the letter
Can everybody
or
else
the
see?
passage.
Maybe my internet's slow here.
What paragraph?
No.
13?
Okay, can we see the screen right now?
I can see paragraph 12, technology innovation.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Rana, when you were a little bit choppy there. Do I sound okay to everybody?
You was freezing.
When she
Like
talks,
right
she
now,
lags.
you
Yeah,
are.
Rana, I think that that might be on your side. Because you're a little choppy too. Yeah. All right, let me see. Is Brittany still?
Keep getting booted out for some reason.
Oh yeah, Brittany's not here. Oh, that's too bad. Okay. Well, yeah, I think if I sound okay to some people, yeah, Rana, it might be. Sorry to say, but it might just be on your side of things. Although I have had my home internet hasn't been
Okay.
great lately, so could be me. I don't know. Okay, Elena, do you want to read paragraph 12?
Okay. Technological innovation influence more than just transportation. As access to electricity became more common and the electric motor was made more efficient, inventors began to churn out new and more complex household appliances. New life developed innovations like radios, photographs, vacuum cleaner, washing machine, and refrigerators emerged, uh, emerged on the market during the period. These new items were expensive, but consumer purchasing innovations like store credit and installment plans made them available to a large segment of the population.
Okay, thank you. So we have inventions, and one of the inventions that makes it possible isn't a physical thing. It's again consumer purchasing innovations like store credit and installment plans. Okay, I can't afford to walk in a store and buy a radio, and radios back then were, not little handheld things, or a phonograph to play records like a record player. Or a vacuum cleaner, a refrigerator, washing machine. These are big things. They cost a lot of money, but maybe I can give $5 a month, $3 a month to buy one of those things. So just as equally as important to the changing of America is the things and also the way to buy the things, right? So those consumer purchasing innovations, that's as important, that's as integral to the changing of America as the things that we're buying, right? If you can invent anything you want, and it can change people's lives, but it's not going to change people's lives unless people have it, right? And these are new things, radios. Now let me see if I can pull up a picture of when we talk about radios. Let's see here. 1920 radio. So here's, this is the kind of radio we're talking. People's, like, they're large. instead of having a television, because there was no television, instead of having a television in your living room, you would gather around at night and listen to the radio. And actually, we're going to talk about radios more next week. But, you know, 1920s, like this is, look how big this thing is. It's just a little dial and you just need to find the frequency. But, you know, the radio, it was physically large, much larger than our radios today. And radios were a big deal. Radio shows, and we're going to talk about more next week, were a very big deal. So people they really wanted to buy radios, and all these other things, washing machines. Now it says many of these new devices promise to give women who continue to have primary responsibilities for housework more opportunities to step out of the home and expand their horizons. Oh, geez, my cat just scared the crap out of me. Did you see that?
Oh.
Oh boy. Oh,
You
my
want to
heart stopped.
study also.
Yeah. Oh, she's scary. Okay. Whew. Okay, so a lot of these ads, you know, a washing machine, even a dishwasher, a vacuum is going to make cleaning, make housework more easy, right?
Mhm.
It says, ironically, however, these labor-saving devices tended to increase the workload for women by raising the standards of domestic work. With the aid of these tools, women ended up cleaning more frequently, washing more often, and cooking more elaborate meals rather than gaining spare time. So it is quicker to vacuum a rug
Mhm.
than, I guess the alternative is to take the rug outside, hang it over your clothesline, beat it, beat the dust out of it. It's quicker to vacuum, right?
Yes.
But as we've seen in life, with everything we have on our smartphones,
Mhm.
just because stuff's quicker doesn't mean life's any easier, right? You still find ways to find that time. If a woman is expected to keep her house clean,
Mhm.
if she can vacuum the rug in 10 minutes instead of 2 hours,
Mhm.
hey, now she's got 2 hours free to go clean something else, right?
Yeah.
So these things, basically, if you look back in history, a lot of inventions
Mm.
are sold in order to make women's lives easier. And
Nice.
yet they may make that thing easier, but overall they're not going to make women's lives easier, which is
Mhm.
it's just an interesting thing to make how that works. Monique, I see you have to go. That's okay. If you got to go, that's fine. I'll send out this. We're almost done. We got 5 more minutes.
Okay.
But Monique, I see your text. If you got to go, that's okay. I'll send out this later.
I didn't
Okay.
want to interrupt. Bye, guys. Thank you.
Okay. See you later.
Okay.
So that's kind of the way things work with consumer products, with these
I'm
time-saving
I'm
things.
sorry, Matt. I'm gonna go too because my internet keep clicking on and off. I'm keep getting booted out and then it'll put me right back in.
Oh, okay. All right, no problem.
Okay.
I'll share
Thank
this
you.
later. You can check it out.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay, so last paragraph. Okay. So despite the fact that the promise of more leisure time went largely unfulfilled, the lure of technology as the gateway to a more relaxed lifestyle endured. So people are, with all, you can buy a radio and sit and relax and listen. You can buy a vacuum, which is going to make your house cleaner and quicker to clean. So there's an expectation people of what they are going to get out of life. 1700s, 1800s, life is hard. You work all day. Life is hard, right? But there's a changing expectation in the 1920s that life doesn't have to be hard. I can have relaxing time, and I can hang out with friends and my children and have free time. And that attitude that's almost a new invention. People expecting to relax is a kind of a new thing. It says this enduring dream was a testament to the influence of another growing industry, advertising. the mass consumption of cars, household appliances, ready-to-wear clothing, meaning clothes you didn't have to make yourself, which that's an interesting idea, and processed foods, which, okay, now you can buy food
Mhm.
that's ready to eat instead of having to make everything, depended heavily on the work of advertisers. Magazines like Ladies' Home Journal and the Saturday Evening Post became vehicles to connect advertisers with middle class consumers. Colorful and occasionally provocative print advertisements decorated the pages of these publications. It became a staple in American popular culture.
Mm.
Okay. So we see some interesting very modern things. Car, obviously very modern. Plane travel, very modern. A lot of these appliances that we think of every day.
Yeah.
Radios, phonographs. Now, I'm not listening to a phonograph, but I do all the time listen to recorded music,
Mhm.
right? Vacuum cleaners, washing machines, refrigerators. Um, a lot of things, a lot of very modern things. Credit and the way to buy things on credit that I don't have the money today, but I'm still going to buy it.
Mhm.
That's a extremely modern thing.
Yes. Mhm.
People, we do
Mhm.
that all the time. From
Yes.
a car to a house to anything you buy on your credit card.
Mhm.
And advertisers advertising in magazines, and now of course we have advertising on Twitter and Instagram and there's advertisements everywhere. There was advertisements before, but there's always been advertising before the 1920s, but it really ramps up in a lot of modern things. Even though this picture here, we don't think of this as modern. It says this is an ad for Palmolive soap. It says keep that wedding day complexion. So if you're a middle-aged woman and maybe your skin's getting a little more wrinkly in the 1920s, you can look like you did on your wedding day if you use 10-cent Palmolive soap, right? Well, wanting to look good and look pretty all the time, that's a pretty modern thing, right, for all of us.
Mhm.
So, we see in the 1920s, and let me scroll back up. So it's 100 years ago, but we definitely start to see in the 1920s our modern world really start to appear.
Mhm.
What do you guys think?
It's great.
Right? So a
Yeah.
lot of things, obviously the
Mhm.
1920s is still very different from today, but
Right.
we see
Oh,
I think we see a
a
lot of
lot.
similarities.
Mhm. Yes.
Yeah. So, any questions?
No, you did good job.
No question. Thank you.
Well, I went past noon, which I always try to not go past noon, but wanted to finish that up today. So I'll
Yeah.
send out this recording and this reading.
Mm.
People can finish reading. Now, next
Okay.
week we're gonna keep thinking about the 1920s and focus on movies, radio, and sports.
Okay.
I like to learn about what was it like to live in that time. I don't
Yeah.
want to be president. I don't want to be rich and famous. I
Right.
wouldn't mind being rich, but I don't need to be rich and famous in the 1920s. I'd like to know really what would it like to be me, just a
Mhm.
regular person in the 1920s. So
Yes.
next week we'll talk about movies, radio. People were going to the movies, people were listening to the radio, going to
Okay.
watch sports.
Okay.
So I think that'll be fun.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Well, thanks for logging in. Thanks for sticking with me for a few minutes, and have a good week. I'll see you next week.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Bye.
Have a
See you
good
later, everybody.